politicians I've learned from, the connection between what I'm supposed to be speaking on and what I'm really speaking on is tenuous to be at best. No, that was a very moving presentation, 10 years of ICAHD, UK. ICAHD itself has been in existence for 17 years, which is hard to believe, since 1997. And the one thing that hasn't changed over all the years is my figure. But we began in 1997, you know, with the collapse really of the Oslo peace process. In other words, it was clear with the election of Netanyahu, if not before then, that there really wasn't a peace process. Nevertheless, a lot of the Israeli left, including aspects of the radical left, had invested a lot of hopes in the Oslo process. There were always critical voices, but we had become fairly dormant over the years, 94, 95, 96, and so on. In some ways, the election of Netanyahu, we all went to bed believing that Paris had won the election and woke up with Netanyahu, which is probably not a huge difference. But it was clear that the Oslo process was over, and we had to kind of reorganize in terms of resisting the occupation. And I was a part of a group in 1997 from different Israeli peace organizations, different Israeli peace activists, and we got together and established the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, having really asked our Palestinian partners what they thought would be, I mean, obviously ending the occupation was the bottom line, but what they thought would be the issue that we in the Israeli peace camp should take on that would be the most useful for them and the most effective in terms of exposing the way the occupation works. And the issue of house demolitions came up all the time. And since then, that's been our focus. It's not that we want to end the policy of house demolitions. I mean, obviously we do. Yesterday, we'd like to end that. But ending the policy of house demolitions doesn't end the occupation itself or go on to a just peace. And therefore, we use that as a vehicle for exposing how the occupation works and for showing the human cost of occupation and for moving our work forward. And it's been, I think, very effective from that point of view. So what I'd like to do this morning, just in the little time I have, is I've been asked to update you very briefly in terms of where ICAHD is itself in Jerusalem, and where we are maybe in terms of the political process today. I don't know if process is the word. And what I'd like to try to do, because I always use these meetings, because you're all friends, and we all know each other. It's not like I'm speaking to some group of strangers, is to kind of brainstorm together. And, you know, I'd like to kind of throw out some ideas of where we might be going in the future. Because I think we're at a point where just resisting the occupation and calling for an end of occupation isn't enough. We have to start thinking beyond that. Where are we going exactly? And, you know, I'm very happy to have Elon with us, who's one of our patrons. And I'm not sure if Elon's going to agree with me. We don't, what's the word, how do you say it? Our positions, we don't, what our positions, something, coordinate our positions. But it would be very interesting to get Elon's take on what I'm saying. Yeah, so that's what I'll do for the next little while. Okay, so I'm in charge here. All right. So just, I don't know if it's possible to get these lights off here, is it? Anyway, it's not, maybe you don't see so well, but let me just begin with really where we are on the ground. You know, we've passed the 29,000 houses and structures demolished, is the way we look at it, in terms of the house demolition policy. in Israel since 1967. About 29,000 structures and homes have been demolished. It's an ongoing policy. In fact, in the last few months, there's been an upsurge in demolitions. Just 3 days ago, 60 Palestinians were displaced from their homes in 1 day. So that this is an ongoing process of ethnic cleansing. And of course it goes back, I'm not going to get into the whole issue, but of course it goes back to 1947, 1948, with the demolition of more than 500 Palestinian communities, villages and towns and urban neighborhoods. It's continued through the occupation since 1967, and of course, as we all know, it goes back into Israel. It never stopped within Israel itself. We all know the Bedouin community of ICAHD in the Negev that's been demolished now, I think it's 63 times and counting. But many demolitions as well in Yafo and Lud and Ramleh, the unrecognized villages, so that in a sense, if we follow the thread of the house demolition issue, it really strengthens the idea that in a sense there is no occupation per se. That we're really talking about the entire country. And the Israeli attempt to Judaize, and that's a term we're trying to get used more in the political arena. You know, there are terms like ethnic cleansing and genocide and occupation and apartheid that have legal references in international law. And part of our strategy is to go to the UN and go to international courts and so on, and foreign courts, and try to build upon, these are concepts that have a legal basis behind them in international law. But there are other things that are happening, like the process of Judaization, that's very important but doesn't have a legal reference. In other words, there's no law against Judaization. And so we're also trying to introduce terminology that we think is useful for capturing where Israel is going. So the whole idea of turning the entire Palestine, the entire land of Israel, into an exclusively Jewish country is a process and a program that's never stopped. So that from the house demolition point of view and the Judaization point of view, we're talking about one country. There's no differentiation between really the occupation and the position of non-Jewish Arab citizens of Israel itself from this point of view. In terms of our work, we continue to do Linda laid it out. I'm not going to get into all of that, all the work we do, especially abroad, because our view is, there's a lot of Israeli organizations that are really excellent, that do work inside Israel, for better or for worse. I'm not sure how effective that is. But ICAHD pioneered, I think, working with Palestinians on the ground, back when we started in the late 1990s. The whole idea of going out and rebuilding homes and working with families, working with Palestinian organizations was something that the left hadn't done very much before. And so in a sense, a lot of the groups that are today working in the occupied territories with Palestinians, Israeli groups like Tayyush, and the anarchists against the wall, the Sheikh Jarrah people and the Silwan people, and Rabbis for Human Rights, and all the groups that do that work in many ways learned with us together doing that. Thanks. My wife Shoshana.
Who's enabled all of this?
We pioneered that, but in many ways, our work, certainly, we were one of the first groups to go out and work in that way. But then I think from there, in a sense, look, our idea was that we want to be a political actor. We don't want to just be a protest group. We don't want to just resist. I mean, resisting is important. We don't want to be just activists, although activism is important as well. And it's a part of resistance, and it's a part of the solidarity movement with Palestinians. And this might sound very arrogant, we want to change policy. We want to be a force in terms of ending the occupation and bringing about a just peace. So that raises a whole area we haven't yet completely solved, but I think we've done a lot of work in that direction over the years. How do you do that? Because governments do not work with civil society. We're not their partners. They're not our friends in particular. I mean, we had a meeting, Linda and I had a meeting in the Foreign Office the other day, very friendly. We get a cup of coffee, and they'll talk with us for a few minutes. They're not really engaging with us. I mean, I'm not going to go back and say, well, we've influenced British foreign policy on Palestine. You know, in other words, I think one of the problems is that we're not partners. We're not their counterparts. We have no power. We have no constituency. We're not elected and so on. And on the other hand, I think there's something here that, at least I feel that maybe should be articulated. And that is that, you know, we look to governments to resolve these conflicts. You know, we're always trying to influence our governments and talk to our politicians and demonstrate in front of Parliament and so on. And I think it's a reasonable assumption because governments call themselves our leaders. We elect them. They have power. And they've arrogated to themselves the exclusive right to negotiate, to sign treaties. We can't sign treaties, the people. And to raise armies, to kill. I mean, the only legal instrument of killing is the state. Is government. So they've aggregated all these powers to themselves, but then they don't resolve conflicts. In other words, governments, in my view, manage conflicts. That's the best they can do. Because the amount of assertion, for example, on this issue, the amount of will you would have to assert, the forces, the pressure you'd have to put on Israel to genuinely get to even a two-state agreement is way too much for the British government or the American government or any other government. You see, there's all kinds of countervailing forces. And so the best the government can do at all, I think, on any issue, is to manage conflicts. And so we're in a kind of a bad marriage. Because on the one hand, we're looking to, you know, we can't end this conflict and go ahead without governments. But on the other hand, they're not our partners. And they really don't want to resolve it. They want to keep it all managed. And therefore, the real question that in front of ICAHD, including ICAHD UK, is how do we insert ourselves into the political process? How do we do it through the UN? And then the UN isn't the most effective way either. You know, do we continue to have meetings in the Foreign Office? How do we mobilize civil society to put pressures on governments? Is there a way to get to the Israeli public? In other words, there's a lot of different approaches that we're trying, but still I think the basic goal of ICAHD in general and all our branches is to try to affect the government policy. We see ourselves as political actors and we're trying to do that. So we work from the ground up in terms of trying to think of where we might be going in the future. So let me begin with the ground. Beit Arabia, that you all know, has become our flagship house. You know, we've built about 187 homes, Palestinian homes, over the last 12, 13, 14 years. As Linda says, as political acts of resistance, not humanitarian. We're against mixing humanitarian with political, and certainly if we were coming from a humanitarian point of view, of good Israelis helping our poor Palestinian victims, the Palestinians would never work with us, and rightly so. So that our message is a political message. We see ourselves as partners with our Palestinian counterparts, and we've rebuilt as political acts of resistance 187 homes, most of which, actually something like 175 still stand. Knock on wood, because demolition orders are permanent. But nevertheless, there is, besides the resistance part, there is a political, practical aspect to it. Not in the case of Beit Arabia, in Salim and Arabia Shawamri, that many of you know, whose home, in fact, has been demolished 6 times because they have a very high profile. And they've been abroad, and they speak out, and diplomats and journalists and others come to visit Beit Arabia, and that's the base of our work camp every summer. And so they've been targeted. In fact, the civil administration officials have told me that they're targeting Beit Arabia. And that's one reason why we rebuild each time. The message being that you know, if you demolish it 100 times, we'll rebuild it 101 times. We are not going to let the occupation win. So that we had Beit Arabia that serves as a kind of a strategy center as well, that was demolished twice in 2012. In January and again in November. Both times in the middle of the night, together with other Palestinian homes in the town of Anata, where Beit Arabia is located, and the same, including the Bedouins up on top, and the same displacement of families goes on in Beit Arabia as it does in hundreds of other Palestinian families. Here's Salim and Arabia at the ruins of their home. So what we did this last summer, just to plug you in, there are a few people here that were in our summer rebuilding camp, was we decided rather than to rebuild the home that is you know, will be demolished again. And in a sense, you know, you do have this issue of limited resources. We thought, okay, we're going to this time excavate the demolition and turn it into a site, a kind of a joint exhibit of house demolitions of ICAHD and the IDF, the Israeli Army, designing this exhibit together. And so we went out last summer. You see, we began with the rubble and the demolition, and we excavated. We cleaned out, and we began to uncover the rooms, even the furniture that had been buried in the demolition, as you can see, and we begin to expose these surfaces, concrete surfaces, the pieces of concrete and the metal that remain. And then we took slides, many of you have seen our presentations, the story of all the 6 demolitions of the homes, going back to 1998, and the rebuilding, and the politics around it, and in a waterproofing kind of a way, we put the pictures and the text on these surfaces that have been exposed from the demolition, and in that way kind of creating an exhibit. So you can today go to Beit Arabia and you can actually walk through the demolition and have the whole story of the demolitions in front of you. These were the 30 participants in last year's work camp. So on the ground, I think that's a very meaningful sort of a thing. But then, of course, what we do is we try to parlay what we learn on the ground. You know, we learn a lot on the ground. Being an anthropologist by profession, you know, anthropologists approach the world from the ground up. We were trained to read the landscape, to ask the question, and it's kind of a cute question. You know, the basic question of anthropology is really the question of life. And that is, what in the hell is going on here? You know? And the hell part is important, because a lot of journalists and a lot of people come and they say, what's going on here? And they talk to this person and that person and they write the article. The hell part, what the hell is going on here, is the critical part. It's the part where you're reading between the lines. You're trying to figure it out in a very in a critical way, knowing that nobody has the whole story, nobody's going to tell you, and even Palestinians who are living it don't know the Israeli part well, don't know other parts, and so you try to put it together. And so we take what we learn from the lay of the land, and that's a very powerful place to begin, because we can see what Israel is doing. We can begin to see patterns. We see the results of it. And then we can begin to relate it to what Israelis are saying, what government officials are saying, what the policies are, and you build from the ground up and analysis. And then we try to take that analysis abroad to work with our partner groups and to work with governments and to work with civil society in general in terms of explaining what's going on. What in the hell is going on here? Now, one of the things that we've done, over the years, as Linda mentioned, is develop maps. The maps become very psychedelic, partly because the reality is psychedelic. And if we sometimes put too much into one map, it's because we're trying to connect what seems to be sometimes disconnected elements, because they're all connected up. And one of the maps I think is one of the most useful is this map, where these areas here, the pink areas, or the pinkish areas here, are what Israel calls its settlement blocks. And this is crucial because this is the basic element of the Israeli approach to negotiations, and it has been since really it was Ehud Barak at Camp David who began to develop the idea of settlement blocks, because he wanted to jump over the different phases of Oslo and to get right to final status issues. Well, if you're going to do that, you have to define, well, what's your bottom line as Israel? And so they began to take this idea of settlement blocks that are parts of Israel. And then in 2004, Bush, the president, Bush, wrote a letter to Sharon saying basically the settlement blocks are Israel. They're not to be negotiated. And the way it was put, I don't have the exact text in front of me, but it's unreasonable, Bush wrote, to expect that Israel will go back to the 1967 borders. So Bush was undercutting his own roadmap idea at the same time that he was trying to push it with the quartet and so on. And the idea being that what did he mean by settlement blocks? He didn't say settlement blocks. He didn't say settlements at all. He didn't say occupation, Bush. How did he put it? He put it that Israel's major population centers will be permanently a part of Israel. And by that he didn't mean Tel Aviv. He meant the large settlement blocks in these areas. So that became the basis of Sharon's convergence plan. And there's all kinds of, we have to keep some institutional memory. And we tend to forget things like Annapolis that seem to be ridiculous, and who remembers the Annapolis process of an hour and a half? Or Olmert getting in front of the American Congress and talking about the convergence plan. But these are elements that never disappear. They change names sometimes and they get reformed, but basically we have to go back and I think what we've managed to do over the years is to bring back these elements into the discussion that tend to be forgotten. And okay, so the idea of settlement blocks, which is the basis of the Israeli position today, is that the Palestinians we will annex the settlement blocks. They're talking maybe about some territorial swaps, but the point I'm getting to is there is no map of settlement blocks. You have never seen a map. The Israeli public has never seen a map. Nobody knows what a settlement block are. Nobody knows if there's 3, if there's 5, if there's 10. What are settlement blocks? The Palestinians have never been given a map. And you know the famous incidents from the negotiations with Olmert that came out of the WikiLeaks with the Palestinians, where Olmert drew a map on a napkin. And Abu Mazen wanted to take the napkin back to talk to his advisors. And he said, no, you can't take any, there's no maps. You see, so it's a map that I don't even think the Palestinians have been privy to. And it's a map that we put together on the basis of figuring things out. What in the hell is going on here? So the borders aren't hard and fast. There isn't a border of settlement blocks. But basically you can say there's 7 settlement blocks. The Jordan Valley, certainly. And I made it kind of like this in a weird way because it's the ridge. It's especially important for Israel. But you know, the Jordan Valley for Israel could be along the Jordan River, it could be the ridge, I'm sure it is the ridge, this Jordan Valley, or if you look at the root of the wall, actually, if you look at the root of the wall, then the Jordan Valley is actually much larger. The Jordan Valley, in principle, is about 30% of the West Bank. So that's one of the settlement blocks, however big it is, that we're talking about. A second settlement block is that of what we call the Ariel block. They're not terms we really use in Israel, because Israelis themselves, including the peace movement, we don't use the term settlement blocks. We don't really, because we really don't, it's not a part of our discourse locally, because I don't think we, even in the peace movement, are plugged enough into where the Israeli government is going into the maps. But a second settlement block, it would be the Ariel block that divides the West Bank east and west here. And when we made this map, we kept this a little bit open. At that time it was a little open because we thought maybe because the international community wants territorial contiguity for a Palestinian state, maybe we'll create a little corridor here. But in fact, this has all been closed since we made the map. And this begins to create then what Sharon and others used to be called cantons. This is a cantonization process. So if you think of a Palestinian state, I don't know if state is overstating it, the way Sharon and these began to look at it, we're certainly talking about cantons. So this begins to create a northern canton. You have the Ariel block. A third block is what we call the Modi'in block. Modi'in is a city here that straddles the Green Line. Upper Modi'in is actually the largest settlement in the West Bank. So that it's the anchor, you know, that connects the Ariel block through this rich agricultural land to the Greater Jerusalem area. And then Greater Jerusalem are the other three more blocks. You have a Givat Ze'ev block here, the Mali Adumim block here, and the Etzion block that create what we call a Greater Jerusalem that really controls the whole central portion of the West Bank. And as you can see, again divides. Mali Adumim itself, in its master plan, you can see the light blue. This right here is the dark blue. This is what you see. But in fact, the light blue is the actual urban jurisdiction of Mali Adumim, which goes from Jerusalem all the way to Jericho and divides the West Bank in half. And that's why even the United States says that if Israel builds just in this little E1 area here, that's the end of the two-state solution, because you've ended any real contiguity between the northern West Bank and the south. And a seventh settlement block comes up from the south to Hebron, like this, because it would be too invasive to come down this way, so it comes up. And that's why you have that whole war against the Palestinian communities living in caves in the South Hebron Hills, because of this corridor. So if you take these are the settlement blocks, basically. I mean, you can shape them down, you can make them larger, you can, you know, but that basically then creates these cantons, a canton in the north, a canton in the south, a canton in the center, in the south, and then Gaza. And that's the maximum that Israel would consider. And in fact, Israel formally rejects the international demand for territorial contiguity. Israel says, no, we will give, if you want an Orwellian term, we will give the Palestinians transportational contiguity. Meaning that, and you see it being built today, you can see it as you go out to Ma'ale Adumim, meaning that Israel will build separate roads for Palestinians underneath the Israeli roads, all controlled by checkpoints that give some kind of transportational, but it rejects the idea of territorial contiguity. So you can see from this, just from this map of the settlement blocks, that Israel's intentions are not to have a viable sovereign Palestinian state. And then if you add to that the root of the wall, and in fact, the root of the wall was added much later than the settlement block idea. So that as we did the other map, the map of the wall, you see the wall, it conforms very closely to areas A and B and to the settlement blocks. So the wall kind of hugs A and B, and when it hits the settlement block, it goes around. You see, and it creates all these cells as well that Palestinians live in. So in a sense, Israel has drawn the map. You just have to be able to interpret it. It's very clear, and Israel, in fact, calls. First of all, as you all know, the name of the wall is not the security barrier. The official name of the wall is the separation barrier. And in fact, Israelis have called it, the government has called it the demographic boundary between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. So Israel would have two eastern borders, which is interesting since there's only one east. The Jordan River, or the Jordan Valley, however big it is, which Israel has always considered, I think since 1947-48, if not before, its security border. Even before the occupation, the Jordan River was seen as Israel's security border, and Netanyahu has said time and time and time again, including in front of the American Congress a couple of years ago, that Israel will never ever give up control of the Jordan Valley. But then the wall itself, I mean, even though this part of the wall isn't going to be built, there's no real reason to spend that money. Nevertheless, the Ministry of Defense very carefully drew the route of the wall, so it's indicating something very significant, even if the wall isn't here. But here where there is the wall, on this side, this is what Israel calls its demographic border between Israel, and including the settlement blocks, and the West Bank. So the Palestinians then get squeezed into cantons in between these two eastern borders, and that's why we say in ICAHD, our policy or our position is, I guess, that the two-state solution is gone. And not only is it gone, but we argue that we have to stop talking about it. Because the more you talk about it, the more you're confusing. You know, if you're bringing up in discussion all the time a solution that's gone, you're just muddying the waters. You're confusing everything. And so, how much more time for? 4 minutes?
We'll be back on in the afternoon.
Okay. All right. So I wanted to get on to one other thing. What I wanted to, first of all, what I wanted to say was that then I think the Kerry initiative is very significant. I mean, I really think it's significant because it's basically I see it as the end of the two-state solution. I mean, even Kerry has sort of said that. You know, this is like the last gasp, this is your last chance. And so I see two benefits coming out of the Kerry initiative. One is, I think it's already failed. I think this week we've seen the collapse of that initiative. The two-state solution is gone. I mean that in a sense, Kerry said that as well. And I can't see after the Kerry initiative, where there's no more political process and no more hope of a political process, how J Street or AIPAC for that matter, or the Israeli government or Peace Now, or how they can continue to talk about a two-state solution. I mean, it's gone. I don't think they know where to go, but it's gone. The two-state solution, and so the air is cleared. In other words, this fog of the two-state solution, that every time you tried to get beyond it, there was this fog that you couldn't penetrate. The air, I think, is clearer now. And the second advantage, and I'll end on this, is I think that it's going to trigger a series of events that are really the collapse. I don't think we can go back. Now here I'm just going out on a limb and see if, I don't know if Elon would agree with me, but
But I don't think we're going to go back to the status quo ante after Kerry. And I see a collapse. You know, part of the problem in our analysis has been that we're looking at things in a linear way. And we're always trying to say, how do we get there? What's the next? Now we're stuck. But so how do we break through? Well, when you're in a linear process, sometimes you're not just stuck, you're at a dead end. It's over, it's gone. You can't sometimes push a linear process. I think this has been exhausted for years, this process. But finally, you know, even Kerry has said the last gasp has gone out of it all. Which means then that we have to factor in collapse. And collapse and chaos can be very positive things because they release a new dynamic so for example, you know, we've moved to, and I had a whole thing about a one-state solution, but I don't have time to get into it now. But
This afternoon.
But the point is that today the one-state solution is a non-starter. I mean, a few academics talking about it and here and there, but it's really, because in this linear kind of there's no place for it. Once a two-state solution is gone, and once a collapse happens, it opens up possibilities for considering solutions and approaches that today aren't even on the table. So I'll say that I see the collapse as having this kind of effect. I think that it could happen in the next few weeks, or it could happen actually in the next few days, where Israel will say, there's no partner for peace, we have to unilaterally ensure our security, and the settlement blocks have already been accepted as a part of Israel by the United States. Annexing them isn't anything new or outrageous. We're simply having given the Palestinians all the opportunities, right? We're simply doing now what the United States saw as reasonable and justified 10 years ago. And that is that we will annex half of Area C, so there could be 30% of the West Bank, could be 40% of the West Bank, that is the settlement blocks. Basically, we're going to annex these settlement blocks to Israel. And I think that's a very reasonable prediction. I mean, it's the policy of some of the key parties in the Israeli government, including a lot of powerful elements within the Likud itself. So that I think Israel would do that, and I think it might do that fairly soon. And again, it will say we have to do it to protect ourselves, and we're not really doing anything unusual. Now, I think, you know, Khalil Shkaki, who's a Palestinian researcher, did a whole study in the last few months that just came out a week or two ago that says most Palestinians, including Palestinian political and academic people, think that the PA is going to collapse sooner rather than later. In other words, whether or not it happens immediately or a week later or a month later or 6 months later, if there's no political process at all, and if Israel certainly annexes half of Area C, the Palestinian Authority, in my view, is going to leave the scene. It'll either resign or collapse, even though there's very powerful elements to keep it afloat. It's lost all its credibility, and Abu Mazen is 80 years old, so at some point there's going to be a change anyway. And I don't see anyone able to replace him because he's the last of the revolutionary generation, so he has a semblance of credibility that allows him to continue on. After him, there isn't anyone like that, and without a political process, the PA is simply a policeman for Israel. And I can't see any way in which it would continue, and that's Israel's nightmare. If the PA collapses, Israel would have to reoccupy, in my view, the Palestinian cities and maybe even Gaza. Because, you know, there's 30,000 Palestinians under arms today, trained by the Americans, who would have no supervision. Hamas in the wings. And so the two benefits I see to the Kerry initiative that take the form of this collapse are the clearing of the air from the two-state solution, allowing us to begin to think about, all right, now what? And here I would hope to be more discussion between critical Israelis and Palestinians than there has been. And second of all, a raw, naked reoccupation that then becomes, I think, so unsustainable. And here's where we all come in, because I think the BDS movement, I think the mobilization that we've all done in our different organizations of civil society that has begun in ways to trickle up into governments will all begin to have an effect. And it's so clear that that would be unsustainable or reoccupation that it would force the hand of the international community. So in these dark days, I guess I have this feeling, if you look at it that way, of optimism, in that we're at the end of this linear process that's exhausted itself. A collapse will happen. It's a good collapse, and it'll begin to, and then, in my last sentence, and then I hope what we have to do as civil society, and especially Palestinians and critical Israelis, and here's where the anti-normalization is really, I think, a problem, because this is the time we should be strategizing. But we have to come up, just because the occupation collapses or is reestablished in an unsustainable way, doesn't mean you're going to get to a just peace. Ending the occupation isn't resolving the whole issue. Where are we going? What do we want? What kind of a one-state solution? A democratic state? A binational state? They're talking about a regional confederation. Can there be a peace, a good peace of Israel-Palestine in a region that's unstable? There's all kinds of issues that if we in the more critical civil society don't start fleshing out some answers and presenting an agenda, a post-collapse agenda, we're going to end up with new opportunities but scrambling and not ready to exploit them. And so I'm really trying in my writings and my work to try as much as I can to get our Palestinian partners and our Israeli partners to begin to think in a proactive way, strategically. That hasn't really happened.